Hello. Today we are starting a new book. I'm excited about this one. It took a long time for this one to come in, over a month. The New Trail of Tears, Naomi Schaefer Riley, How Washington is Destroying American Indians. A much needed revelation of heartbreaking conditions on American Indian reservations. Thomas Sowell. Let's just get into it. The Library of Congress has cataloged the hardcover edition. Let's start with the preface. A preface to the paperback edition. The populations that were hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic were the ones that were already the most vulnerable. Nowhere did this observation seem truer than on Indian reservations. According to the Centers for Disease Control, the rate of infection among American Indians was 3 to 5 times that among white Americans. And young American Indians were affected more severely than young members of other races, likely because of pre-existing health conditions like obesity and smoking. In Montana, the hard-hit Northern Cheyenne tribe lost about 50 people, 1% of the reservation's population, to COVID. Nationwide, American Indians were nearly twice as likely to die from COVID compared to non-Hispanic whites. The death rate among Native Americans was 1 in 475, compared to 1 in 825 among white Americans, and 1 in 645 among Black Americans. The true death toll for Native Americans is likely much higher due to spotty reporting of reservation COVID data by many states. In the 5 years since this book was originally published, things have not improved for folks living on reservations and, in many ways, have worsened. The health outcomes of this population are inextricably tied to the poor performance of the Indian Health Service. With a $6 billion program serving more than 2.6 million individuals, the IHS has been the subject of numerous scandals since its inception. But investigations by the Wall Street Journal in recent years have revealed an unimaginably corrupt agency with an arrogant and unaccountable leadership. In 2019, the journal revealed that it had examined 163 malpractice claims against the IHS that the government settled or lost since 2006. 1 out of 4 doctors involved in those cases worked for the IHS, despite a history that should have raised red flags by the agency's own standards. Unquote. Further, quote, at least 66 of the patients died as a result of the alleged malpractice, unquote. While, quote, insurance actuaries say U.S. doctors typically have 1 malpractice claim every 20 years or so. The IHS was willing to hire doctors with many more lawsuits in their past, in some cases more than 10 in less than a decade, unquote. A separate joint investigation between PBS's Frontline and the Wall Street Journal found that a doctor with the IHS was able to treat children for 21 years, despite, quote, leaving behind a trail of sexual assault allegations, unquote. The reporters also found that, quote, IHS repeatedly missed or ignored warning signs, tried to silence whistleblowers, and allowed the offending doctor to continue treating children despite the suspicions of colleagues up and down the chain of command, unquote. Moreover, quote, the agency tolerated a number of problem doctors because managers there believed they might face retaliation if they followed up on suspicions of abuse, unquote. When an independent report was commissioned to see what went wrong, the IHS refused to relate its contents, claiming that to do so would violate medical confidentiality laws. When members of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs demanded its release, the IHS defended its position, saying that revealing the findings would, quote, serve to dampen, not encourage, unquote, reports of misconduct in the future. The agency said it was, quote, working hard to change, unquote, a culture of fear. Astonishingly, keeping criticisms from the public eye seemed to be part of that process. In other words, the leadership of a federal agency caught in a scandal that shattered numerous lives suggested that the agency should not be subject to any kind of government oversight. Should we really be increasing the budget and expanding the role of unaccountable agencies with such poor track records? And it's not just in healthcare services. In education, too, the government has continued to fail the Native population. During the 2018 through 19 school year, fewer than 1 in 4 Native American students in grades 3 to 8 and grade 11 were rated as proficient in reading and writing on standardized state tests. Roughly 1 in 7 Native American students was proficient in math, and just 1 in 8 was proficient in science. In North Dakota, Native students' graduation rate is about 20 points lower than white students'. In South Dakota, the gap between Native students and students of all other backgrounds is 30 points. The schools run by the Bureau of Indian Education continue to turn in abysmal performances. Though they educate only 8% of Native students, they regularly post the lowest achievement outcomes. And like the IHS, the BIE's long tradition of corruption has continued in recent years. In 2016, the Government Accountability Office reported that one BIE school, 4 boilers had failed an inspection due to high carbon monoxide levels in a natural gas leak, but not been repaired for about 8 months. The BIE director since November 2016, Tony Dearman, became the 37th person to hold the position in 37 years, after his predecessor used his influence to get jobs for a close relative and a woman with whom he had a romantic relationship. Dearman himself has been accused of impropriety in the handling of fiscal reviews at BIE schools. Never mind that, the BIE budget will grow to almost $1 billion in 2021. Meanwhile, viable education alternatives for Indian students have remained limited. Of the 5 states without charter school laws, 3, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana, are home to some of the largest Indian populations. In February 2021, a push to allow the creation of charter schools in South Dakota was defeated, with lawmakers arguing that they did not want money taken away from traditional public schools. Of course, the fact that those schools are failing Native kids, and plenty of other kids too, was not much considered. The voices of American Indian leaders who wanted to import a charter school model that had had success in closing achievement gaps in New Mexico were ignored. And while high-achieving charter schools in places like New York and Texas continue to improve the test scores of large populations of poor and minority students, these schools are not allowed to open locations in areas that could serve Indian populations. Native parents are not only deprived of a decent education for their children, but also unable to raise them in a safe environment. There's a little good news to report when it comes to combating violent crime on Indian reservations. In 2020, President Trump signed 2 bills to address the ongoing epidemic of missing, murdered, and trafficked Indigenous women. But these laws intend to improve coordination between tribal and federal authorities and create an advisory council to help the Departments of Justice and the Interior do a better job of investigating these crimes, are unlikely to tackle the real problems behind the violence. Most of these crimes are committed on Indian lands by Indians themselves, and law enforcement in these communities is lacking and often ineffective. Moreover, federal authorities are loath to become entangled in these matters even when it is their responsibility. A 2017 report from the Inspector General highlighted excuse me, U.S. Attorneys' uneven track record of prosecuting serious violent crimes on reservations. A law had been passed in 2010 to help improve prosecution rates. Before the law, the Government Accountability Office found that U.S. attorneys declined to prosecute fully half of cases on reservations, leading to concerns that the practice was creating a safe haven for criminals on tribal lands. The latest figures from 2016 show that U.S. attorneys declined to prosecute 46% of reservation cases, marking only marginal improvement. That included rejecting more than 550 assault and sexual assault cases, more than any other type of crime. Prosecutors cited insufficient evidence as the reason for the vast majority of rejections. But the danger is only likely to grow for law-abiding citizens living on reservations. The Indian crime problem is on a collision course with growing demands by tribes for greater sovereignty over their territory. In June 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that about half of Oklahoma, including the city of Tulsa, is within a Native American reservation. While the ruling's ramifications will depend on a forthcoming agreement with Congress, it seems certain that tribes will have greater authority to administer justice in their hands. This will not only require more and better law enforcement, but also test the tribal court systems. On many Indian territories, defendants can be sentenced to only a year in prison. The Supreme Court decision makes it possible for a tribe to assert its jurisdiction even in serious cases. This is raising concerns among those who worry that some tribes don't want to incarcerate their members at all. Tribes will sometimes use alternative forms of punishment, including banishment, or rehabilitation, and restitution. These alternatives could include mowing grass, picking up trash, or removing graffiti. Or they could involve more culturally specific options, such as participating in religious ceremonies, writing research papers on tribal history, or being subject to public shaming. What are the chances these penalties will deter serious criminals? Other delegations of power to the tribes seem to disregard the safety of vulnerable citizens as well. In 2019, the state of North Dakota signed an agreement with 5 tribes, including Spirit Lake, to expand their authority to certify foster homes located off the reservation, as well as those on reservation land. The results have been sadly predictable. Take the fate of 5-year-old Raven Thompson, whose body was found in May 2020 in the home of her foster parents, Eric and Tammy Longy, on the Spirit Lake Reservation. Raven's autopsy revealed blunt force trauma to the head, neck, chest, abdomen, and extremities. Her brother Zane, aged 7, was found with similar injuries and in critical condition in the back of a Suburban parked outside. The 2 other children in the couple's care also showed signs of severe abuse and were immediately removed from the home. Tribal Social Services of North Dakota had placed the Thompson children with the Longys after their father was sent to prison. According to the order of detention filed by the U.S. Attorney in North Dakota, 4 other children previously placed with the Longys had been, quote, removed by Tribal Social Services and placed in placement agreements prohibited any contact between Eric or Tammy and those children, unquote. It has been a decade since whistleblowers informed federal and state officials that Tribal Social Services repeatedly place children in dangerous situations, sometimes with known sex offenders. The whistleblowers were at first ignored and then punished. And now, apparently, the answer is to give these agencies more power to make life-changing decisions about the placement of children. The question of who is in charge of protecting the residents of reservations from violent crime remains unclear, even to those responsible for enforcing the law. In 2017, the movie Wind River, a fictional thriller about a rape and murder on a reservation in Wyoming, illustrated this problem better than I ever could have. At the climax of the film, When authorities think they have found the perpetrator, there are 7 men and 1 woman, including members of tribal police, a private security firm guarding a drilling site, and the FBI, all with guns drawn on each other. And they are screaming about who has, quote, jurisdiction, unquote. Sadly, this is not far from reality. Poverty is both a cause and effect of this lawlessness. People cannot build their lives and plan for the future when their safety and the safety of their families are always in question. But building wealth requires other conditions besides the rule of law. It requires property rights, and there has been little progress on this front. Reservation land is not owned by individuals. It's held in trust by the federal government, making it impossible for Native Americans to get mortgages or borrow against their homes to start small businesses. Efforts by Indians to use their land for development, reservations, cover 2% of the United States, but they may contain about a fifth of the nation's oil and gas, along with vast coal reserves. Almost invariably meet with meddling from the federal government and environmental activists. Meanwhile, many Indian leaders are placing their own short-term interests over the tribe's ability to participate in and profit from the energy market. The resolution of the Dakota pipeline controversy in 2016 was instructive. Even though the Army Corps of Engineers conducted 389 meetings with 55 tribes to discuss the path of the pipeline from Iowa to North Dakota, protests by the Standing Rock Sioux and many activists, including Hollywood celebrities, persuaded the Obama administration to divert the pipeline. The pipeline was never going to be constructed on reservation land itself, but the federal government ensured that it wouldn't even travel near a reservation. The decisions about what happens on Indian lands have little to do with any concern for the well-being of tribes or individual Indians, who could use the money and the jobs that come from such development. These policies are merely an extension of environmentalist politics. Whether it's the Keystone Pipeline or the Dakota Pipeline, the problem is the pipeline. Both would supposedly destroy the pristine environment. If blocking one means also being able to claim the mantle of support for indigenous rights, well, so much the better. President Obama ushered in an era of regulatory uncertainty in Indian country. Now, when private firms want to undertake any kind of construction project, they know to keep economic activity as far from Indian territory as possible. Though the Trump administration did try to give Native Americans more control over some lands, for instance, by reducing the size of the Bears Ears National Monument in southeastern Utah, to allow Indians the freedom to farm, graze cattle, and drill for oil and gas. The Biden administration has already rolled back these reforms. Even though there's evidence that tribes manage lands better than the federal government, the interests of folks like Leonardo DiCaprio, who like to vacation in Bears Ears, took precedence over the interests of American Indians who actually live, work, and engage in tribal rituals there. Terry Anderson, former president and executive director of the Property and Environmental Research Center, PERC, based in Bozeman, Montana, told me he was initially optimistic about the Trump administration's ability to, quote, to make some inroads into the paternalism of the tribal economy, unquote. But whether because of other more pressing issues or simply because the bureaucracy is too dense to reform, Anderson says, quote, they didn't do much to open those doors, unquote. And that window of opportunity is now shut. Deb Haaland, President Biden's pick for Secretary of the Interior, who oversees the Bureau of Indian Affairs, is likely to continue these harmful policies. While Haaland is being hailed as the first Indian cabinet secretary, her views on energy development are likely to hurt Indian economies. Her opposition to fracking and her support for the Green New Deal will come at a cost of much-needed development on Indian lands. When it comes to what the most vocal Indian leaders say they want from the new administration, the list is as predictable as it will be ineffective. More money for public infrastructure projects, the IHS, and education. But more money won't fix the problems. It will go to the same exact federal agencies that have suffered from mismanagement and corruption for years. And what little trickles down to reservations will have almost no long-term impact. Some tribes, though, are trying to take matters into their own hands. Anderson views the Winnebago tribe in Nebraska and the Southern Ute in Colorado as leaders in, quote, opening the eyes of tribal leaders to the potential of weaning themselves from grants and focusing on revenue that can be generated, unquote, from construction and energy development. Among Canada's First Nations, the COVID crisis seems to have accelerated this inclination towards self-development. Indigenous Canadians started to think, quote, we seem to be back of the line for all of this government aid. We better look out for ourselves, unquote, says Andre Le Dresse, Director of Fiscal Realities Economists, which does development work with some bands in Canada. Quote, when it came to a real crisis, where do you rank? Not as high as you think, unquote. So First Nations are taking small practical steps, from building a more sensible land title registry system to streamlining the process for infrastructure projects on reserve land. Indigenous leaders to the north are moving to increase their economic independence and increase opportunities for wealth creation. Money from gambling continues to trickle in, both in Canada and the United States, of course, but COVID hampered the ability of even the most successful casinos to operate. For instance, Connecticut's Foxwoods casinos profits fell 31.6% in 2020. And state governments have begun to see the profits that Indian casinos do bring in as another source of public revenue. In 2019, a court upheld a claim that the Seneca tribe owed about $255 million to New York State. According to the terms of a 2002 agreement, the Senecas were supposed to send a quarter of revenue generated from slot machines and video lottery machines to the state, but they stopped paying in 2017. Now, Seneca casino operators are hoping to make up for this loss by expanding their business into sports betting. Some Indian leaders realize that this combination of government benefits and casino revenue is not a recipe for healthy and prosperous communities. The Alliance for Renewing Indigenous Economies has been holding conferences and supporting scholarship to help, quote, the next generation of Indigenous leaders appreciate the rich history of entrepreneurship and trade before European contact, and develop better tools for undertaking self-determination, unquote. But activists, many of them non-native, always seem to be much louder. Instead of focusing on the things that actual American Indians need, equal protection under the law, access to free markets, educational choice, enforceable property rights, they are engaged in superficial culture war battles. The past 5 years have seen glorious successes on this front. In 2020, the Washington Redskins finally decided to change the name of their team to, well, we don't know yet. But, in the meantime, it's the Washington football team. The Cleveland Indians, too, are planning to retire their mascot in 2021. In 2020, the Chicago Board of Education voted to change the name of Columbus Day to Indigenous People Day. How these changes might do anything to reduce the poverty, violence, and lack of educational opportunity that plague reservations is unclear. But maybe now those battles are won, activists and Indian leaders can put their efforts into something more likely to yield tangible results. Introduction. What does America O Indians. When my daughter was in second grade, she came home with what seemed like a typical assignment. Asked to read about how the Dutch swindled Native Americans into giving up Manhattan for a pile of beads. She then had to write a paragraph about how the natives must have felt. This exercise in empathy was puzzling for her, and I presume millions of other school children receiving similar instructions, not to mention their parents. There's rarely much context to these lessons, but more importantly, there's little sense in our school curricula that American Indians are anything more than a historic artifact. Most Americans know nothing about what life is like for the 3 million Indians today, particularly the 1 million living on reservations. If you ask people what ails American Indians, they'll be quick to tell you about what white people did to them 100, 200, or 400 years ago. Americans who read a newspaper might come across articles every once in a while about suicide or poverty on reservations. They might see stories about rape or child abuse or alcoholism. And sometimes they might take note of a casino being built on Indian land. But these stories are typically so depressing that most of us would rather turn our heads and turn the page. According to statistics compiled from various federal agencies, American Indians have the highest rate of poverty of any racial group in the nation, almost twice the national average. This deprivation seems to contribute not only to higher rates of crime, but also to higher rates of suicide, alcoholism, gang membership, and sexual abuse. In 2011, the suicide rate for Native American men ages 15 to 24 was 57% higher than for the general population. Suicide is also the leading cause of death for Native American males aged 10 to 14. Alcohol use disorders are more likely among American Indian youths than those belonging to other racial groups. Involvement in gang activity is more prevalent among Native Americans than it is among Latinos and African Americans. Native American women report being raped 2.5 times as often as the national average. The rate of child abuse among Native Americans is twice as high as the national average. What's more, each of these problems is statistically worse when the results are restricted to Native Americans who live on reservations. For example, an estimated 1 out of every 4 girls and 1 out of every 6 boys in Indian country is molested before the age of 18. It's no wonder most Americans would rather not think about this population. The United States is the wealthiest nation on earth, but we have what amounts to a third world country within our borders. Critics like to say it's easy for the wealthy to ignore the problems of our inner cities because the wealthy can simply avoid these neighborhoods. It's even easier for the wealthy to ignore the problems of Indian reservations in South Dakota and Montana because they never have to think about these neighborhoods, much less see them from the window of a train or a car. By the time most American students get to college and take courses in ethnic studies, they learn what ails American Indians is their history. Indians' decades, centuries of victimization at the hands of whites are only being compounded by non-Indians' perpetual insensitivity. And if only we could somehow return Indians to their state of nature, quote, pre-contact, unquote, professors tell students, Indians would be saved. Barring that, though, there's little we can do. This kind of education tends to lead people to 2 conclusions. The first is that America should give Indians as much money as possible from the federal coffers. It's only fair that the nation make good on its promises to provide for them. And really, it should do more than that. It should offer some kind of reparations for the harm inflicted upon Indians by westward expansion, by wars, by racism, and by the reservation system. The second is that we should make sure that American Indians don't have to continue to suffer the indignities of having their culture mocked or degraded. So we should seek out any form of the old way of thinking about Indians and eradicate it. To deal with the question of money first, The two primary agencies charged with overseeing the activities of the roughly 1 million Indians who live on reservations, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, and the Bureau of Indian Education, BIE, both part of the Department of Interior, have a total of 9,000 employees. That's one employee for every 111 Indians on a reservation. According to a report from a Cato Institute, federal funding for these agencies, various subsidy programs, which cover programs for education, economic development, tribal courts, road maintenance, agriculture, and social services, was almost $3 billion in 2015. About $850 million of this is the BIE's share for providing for its 42,000 students. Most children on reservations don't attend BIE schools, which amounts to about 20,000 per pupil, compared to the national average of 12,400. But that's not all. As the report from the Cato Institute notes, quote, aside from the BIA and BIE, many other federal agencies have subsidy programs for American Indians. The Department of Health and Human Services houses the Indian Health Service, which has a budget of about $4 billion. The Department of Housing and Urban Development runs the Native American Housing Block Grant Program, which has a budget of about $800 million. And the Department of Education spends more than $300 million a year on BIE schools. What have American Indians gotten for all this money? Not much, it seems. It's not just that the education these children receive is deplorable. The BIE can't even keep the buildings from falling down. As John Klein, a Republican congressman from Minnesota, explained at a hearing in May 2015, quote, you've got collapsing roofs, leaking roofs, bucking floors, exposed wires, popping circuit breakers, gas leaks. That's totally unacceptable, unquote. He noted, quote, you can't be well educated, in my opinion, when you're attending school, wearing your coat, wearing your own mittens, and hoping that the blanket keeps out the 30-degree below zero air, unquote. Klein is right, but most observers seem to agree it's largely a problem of management, not money, that has gotten the BIE to where it is today. The agency is on its 36th director in 33 years. To address the crumbling infrastructure in the budget for 2016, the Obama administration asked for $1 billion for the BIE. But if the past is any guide, it's unlikely that things will change. As for sensitivity to the cultural and historical plights of Indians, what we teach our children in schools is typically is the history of white encounters with Indians over 100 years ago. A study by Sarah Shearer, professor at the University of Missouri, found that 87% of references to American Indians in state academic standards portrayed them in a pre-1900 context. According to Shearer, when students arrive in her college classroom, they are largely ignorant about modern Indians. Quote, what they told me is that they learned about Thanksgiving in Columbus Day, unquote. She told a writer for the Indian Country website, quote, every once in a while, a student would mention something about the Trail of Tears. It was incredibly frustrating. They were coming to college believing that all Indians are dead, unquote. Even when states adopt formal standards to address the issue of Native American history, the content is typically about the raping and pillaging of Indian communities in the past. Take Utah's curriculum on the Indians, which teaches high school students about 5 major tribes found there today. Of the Navajos, for instance, students will learn in the winter of 1863-1864, after their crops, livestock, and homes had been destroyed by the United States Army under Christopher Kit Carson, over 8,000 Navajos were forced to walk 12 to 15 miles a day with little food and little or no protection from the winter weather, from their ancestral homelands to the remote and desolate Bosque Redondo Reservation. The memory of the Long Walk has haunted generations of Navajos, and the story of the Long Walk is important to the history of Utah's Navajos. Some Navajos were able to escape the army and moved into what is now southeastern Utah. To the extent they're even paying attention, most American children's knowledge of the history of American Indians will include starvation, death by diseases brought from Europe, and massacres at the hands of white settlers, all of which is certainly true. They'll rarely hear about the brutalities that Indians committed against white settlers, however. These students will come to see Indians as people who lived off the land and worshiped nature. Our first environmentalists, perhaps. Indeed, there are those who will take from their lessons that the people indigenous to North America are to be emulated in modern times because of their respect for the earth and its creatures. School children commonly learn the words of Chief Seattle, who allegedly wrote to the United States government in 1851, quote, "The president in Washington sends word that he wishes to buy our land. But how can you buy or sell the sky, the land? The idea is strange to us. If we do not own the freshness of the air and the sparkle of the water, how can you buy them? Every part of this earth is sacred to my people. Every shining pine needle, every sandy shore, every mist in the dark woods, every clearing and humming insect is wholly in the memory and experience of my people." Unquote. As Fergus Bordwick notes in his book, Killing the White Man's Indian, quote, "More than any other single document, Seattle's words lend support to the increasingly common belief that, to Indians, any disruption or commercialization of the earth's natural order is sacrilege, and that the most moral, the most truly, quote, Indian, unquote, relationship with the land is a kind of poetic passivity." Seattle has achieved a kind of prophetic stature among environmentalists, unquote. Too bad much of this mythology is complete bunk. The earliest version of the speech was composed in 1887, quote, "from memory," unquote, by a white doctor who claimed to have been present at its delivery. The most commonly reproduced version was actually written in 1972 by Ted Perry, a Texas scriptwriter, to serve as narration for a film produced by Southern Baptist Radio and Television Commission, which wished to give its audience a warning about the environment, unquote. The use of such stories probably does more to assuage white guilt than it does to alleviate the problems plaguing Indians. The real question is this: if not sensitivity and money, what does America owe Indians? In the past 2 years, I've traveled to Indian communities around the United States and Canada. I've interviewed tribal leaders, economists, educators, business people, and government officials, all in an effort to understand what ails American Indians, particularly those on reservations. The results are by no means a comprehensive history of American Indians, or even a complete picture of American Indians today. There are 562 federal recognized Indian nations in the United States, about half of which are in Alaska, and 310 reservations. Any book about American Indians will have to make some generalizations, and for that, I apologize in advance. But the fact that these groups have different cultural traditions, different treaties, and different economic, political, and social situations doesn't mean they have nothing in common. As you'll see in this book, the problems American Indians face today, lack of economic opportunity, lack of education, and lack of equal protection under the law, and the solutions to these problems require a different approach from the misguided paternalism of the past 150 years. It's not the history of forced assimilation, war, and mass murder that have left American Indians in a deplorable state. It's the federal government's policies today. These policies were begun by officials who didn't know or didn't care about what might help Indians. Today, they're carried out on by officials who claim to care but can't seem to grasp the problems these policies are causing. The tragedy of America's Indian policies demands immediate examination, not only because they make the lives of millions of American citizens harder and more dangerous, but also because they're a microcosm of everything that has gone wrong with modern liberalism. They're the result of decades of politicians and bureaucrats showering a victimized people with money and sensitivity instead of what they truly need: the autonomy, the education, and the legal protections to improve their own situations. American Indians, like all Americans, must be able to avail themselves of the economic and legal freedoms of this country guarantees. Until then, they'll remain mired in poverty, social pathology, and the kind of anger that comes from knowing that your fate is controlled by ill-informed and ineffective bureaucracies. What America really owes Indians is nothing less than the opportunity to live lives of freedom and dignity in the land we all share. Part 1, The False Promise of Sovereignty. Chapter 1, Someone Else's Responsibility. Property Rights as Native Rights. Quote, "It's free money," unquote. A Crow legislator by the name of Carl Little Owl tells Ivan Small. Small, an older man who has known Little Owl since he was a child, laughs skeptically. Quote, "Really? How's that?" Unquote. Quote, "We didn't have to spend a dime on the tribe's funds on this," unquote. Quote, "A good thing," unquote. Small replies, chuckling, quote, "Since the tribe doesn't have any money," unquote. We're standing just outside a tent where a ceremony to mark the breaking of ground on Apsaluk warrior apartments is about to begin. The first development project on the Crow Reservation in about a decade, Apsaluk Warrior Apartments will be a 15-bed veterans' home perched on a hill overlooking Crow Agency, the reservation's political center. A couple of miles from the battlefield where Custer made his last stand, the home will no doubt be a reminder of Indians' Pyrrhic victory here in Montana and the fact that it was short-lived. Soon after the Battle of Little Bighorn, the United States Army succeeded in removing the remaining Indians from their land and putting them on reservations. In recent times, the policies that resulted in the mass extinguishment of Indian lives have been replaced by policies that result in their mass impoverishment and an existence circumscribed by violence and tragedy. Here, under the tent, though, there's great celebration. Representatives of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the state of Montana, and tribal leadership are present. One person after another takes the podium to congratulate the individuals who spearheaded this development, applied for the grants, and waded through the bureaucratic morass, though no one dares call it that, to get this project off the ground. After about a dozen speeches, the four tribal leaders donned feathered bonnets, and sing a traditional song in their native Crow. Then each takes a golden shovel and turns over a piece of the soil. At a cost of just under $8 million, the development wouldn't have been possible without a combination of federal, state, and private donations. The Crow tribe is broke, as Small observes, for a variety of reasons. There's next to no economic activity on the reservation. In this desolate area in southeastern Montana, the unemployment rate is 47%, when you include people who have given up looking for jobs. The people who are employed almost all work for the tribal government. And then there's this. The tribe, according to its leadership, owes the Department of Housing and Urban Development about $3 million. In the 1990s, HUD built most of the homes on the reservation, and the tribal leadership promised to exact a small monthly payment from each homeowner. Conrad Stewart, who used to work in the tribal housing office and now chairs the Natural Resources Infrastructure Committee for the Crow tribe, says that the payments were to be between $20 and $30 a month. But then the tribe members, among them people in Small's own extended family, refused to pay. Instead, Stewart says, quote, when the tribe tried to go and recoup some of the money, they made threats. They said the tribe should pay for this, and the tribe has been paying for it ever since, unquote. Now the situation is getting bleaker. HUD, the tribal leaders tell me, refuses to build any more homes until the money is paid back. And so, no homes are being constructed or repaired. Instead, more and more people are moving into each small trailer home. The result is that 75% of tribal members between the ages of 18 and 40 don't have homes, according to Stewart. Stewart blames part of this problem on the tribal government's lack of forethought. Quote, they were thinking about the short term, because a lot of times the administration, they campaigned and then they got that 1 year to do something. Well, the next year, it's campaign season again, unquote. Tribal governance was no doubt an issue here, and the Crow tribe has taken steps to improve the situation. In 2001, it instituted 4-year terms instead of 2-year terms for the chair and other executive positions. Quote, now we have 3 years of business and 1 year of campaigning, unquote, notes Stewart with forced optimism. Even so, when the tribal government attempted to pass legislation that would require people to pay their debt to HUD, Stewart says, the, quote, old-timers, unquote, were telling people, quote, you do this, and then they're going to take all our homes, and then they're going to kick everybody out on the streets. Everyone will be homeless, unquote. 14 versions of the Financial Protection and Procedures laws intended to address this situation were reviewed before one was passed, says Stewart of this legislative ordeal. Quote, these people would cut your throat, unquote. Of course, for anyone with a basic understanding of economics and political science, nothing in this story is surprising. If your political representative is also your landlord, and you don't feel like paying your rent, you'll vote him out of office. But when you do that, it'll affect both your own ability to get credit and others' ability to convince someone to build them a home. But what choice do Crows have? Almost no one on the reservation can afford to build a home because no one can get a mortgage. And no one can get a mortgage because their property on the reservation is held, quote, in trust, unquote, by the federal government, and most of it is, quote, owned, unquote, communally by the tribe. Which means, effectively, that no bank could ever foreclose on a property because the bank can't own reservation land. Even town centers on many Indian reservations are desolate places. Small says there are fewer shops now in Lame Deer, Montana, the capital of the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, than there were when he was growing up there. There's a small casino, the size of a suburban house, just outside of town. Few non-Indians have a reason to come through Lame Deer, however, so the dozen or so customers at the casino are almost all Indians. These gamblers are effectively taking money given to them by the tribal government for food or housing and giving it back to the tribe through its slot machines. And the leaders in Lame Deer don't seem particularly interested in bringing more visitors to town. Winfield Russell, vice president of the Northern Cheyenne Tribal Council, complains to me about the 18-wheelers that use the town's main road to avoid the interstates, but rather than a rest stop, which would bring the tribe some revenue, he shows me a design for a new traffic pattern that will discourage truckers from using the road at all. Small and I spend 3 days driving around southeastern Montana together. The early May scenery is beautiful, and yet somehow depressing as the occasional snow flurry falls. But every few miles, we come upon a group of 10 to 30 trailer homes that, as anyone can see, are a blight on the land. Broken down cars and trucks are scattered outside the homes like crushed soda cans. Many homes' windows are broken, with only a kind of tarp separating the residents from the elements. Residents say they're waiting for HUD to come fix things. Children's toys are piled up haphazardly, mixed with lawn chairs and trash. Menacing stray dogs roam everywhere, searching for food. Quote, "A man's home is his castle," unquote, Small mutters over and over as we survey these neighborhoods. Sometimes he laughs. A big man with darkened skin and a full head of white hair. Small sometimes seems angry, but mostly he looks tired. As we drive through the Crow and Cheyenne reservations, Small points out the places he and his extended family have lived. He has spent most of his life here. His mother was Crow and his father was Northern Cheyenne. He grew up with 6 siblings on a farm. Their house had no running water. He's somewhat nostalgic though. Quote, "At least back then, there wasn't so much crime," unquote. Violent crime on the country's 310 reservations is, on average, about 2.5 times as high as the national average. Fueling the crime are alcohol and drugs, methamphetamines especially. But Small thinks there's little law enforcement, both from federal government and from the tribe itself. Each morning I set out with Small. He stops in Lame Deer. The town contains a gas station, a half-stock supermarket, a Catholic church, a school, and a coffee shop. On the first morning we arrive, the woman making Small his latte tells us that the shop was robbed the night before. The culprit stole all the candy in the glass display case, as well as 5 left flip-flops from the shelf full of gift items. Quote, "At least it won't be hard to find him," unquote. Another customer jokes, imitating a man hobbling on one foot. The same dark sense of humor pervades the conversation about the condition of the reservations, particularly among older residents. They've seen it all before, and they don't expect anything to get better. Small, who owns some land and a few head of cattle, recently tried to buy land from a neighbor of his on the Crow reservation. The two had agreed on the price, but the Bureau of Indian Affairs blocked the deal. The BIA had recently had land on the reservation appraised as part of a buyback program. The federal government was going to trade one plot of land to the tribe for another, and the appraiser had put a higher value on the land than the price that Small and his neighbor had agreed upon. Excuse me. In fact, Small tells it that BIA told the appraiser to overvalue the land so as not to, quote, "screw the Indians," unquote. Small is past the point of anger, though, and he laughs. He's no economist, but he's well aware, as he tells me, quote, "Land is worth what someone is willing to pay for it," unquote, not what some outside appraiser decides. Similar stories could be told about jobs, healthcare, and land management on reservations. We'd like to think that stricter regulation or larger grants or other forms of government intervention or support would solve the many problems on reservations. But there are too many policies standing in the way of real improvements. It's not only that the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Indian Education are perhaps the most inefficient of all federal bureaucracies. It's not only that Washington officials are far removed from the people they serve, though 90% of the staff of these bureaucracies are Indians themselves. It's that the BIA's purpose is unclear. How do we arrive at the sad state of affairs? Between 1777 and 1871, the federal government signed over 400 treaties with American Indians. In the 1850s, the reservation system was devised as a way of ending the Indian Wars and moving Indians off of land that white settlers wanted for farming, ranching, or mining. Tribes agreed to give up the land they occupied and moved to reservations in exchange for payments and other benefits. Of course, often, these promises weren't kept. Tribes often ended up far from their homelands. Not only were their new lands less desirable because they had fewer natural resources, American Indians had no idea how to live on them. But in small ways, they began to adapt. This evolution, in fact, was already underway. In his book, Sovereign Nations or Reservations, Terry Anderson notes, quote, "Even before interaction with Europeans, Indian institutions were evolving as a result of changing resource values and technology. Perhaps as much as any other factor, the horse changed the lives of Indians. With the horse, transportation costs declined significantly, as did the cost of harvesting buffalo. The result was that many otherwise sedentary tribes took to a more nomadic life." Unquote. In principle, there's no reason that tribes couldn't have adapted themselves again to a more sedentary life on the reservation, however unjust the reason they'd wound up there in the first place. But tribal autonomy had been compromised. American Indian communities' ability to subsist often depended on the federal administrators assigned to each tribe, who treated them like children assigned to their care. For example, Indians weren't permitted to leave reservations in search of food. Thus, many tribes needed outside shipments of food and other resources in order to survive. This meant that any small delay of appropriations from the federal government could lead to mass starvation or armed conflict. Agents were supposed to supervise the relationship between Indians and white settlers, including any commercial activity. But by the late 19th century, their roles had shifted to include the forced assimilation of Indians into American culture. Agents oversaw the education of Indians, enforced a prohibition on alcohol, and ensured that, quote, "no Indian should be idle for want of an opportunity to labor or of instructions as to how to go to work. And if farm work is not extensive enough to employ all idle hands, some other occupation should be introduced." Unquote. Of course, this relationship was understood mostly in racial terms. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a popular as well as an academic fascination with racial classification. New waves of immigration from Europe, the post-Civil War period of Reconstruction, and the Indian Wars out west made white Americans hugely interested in and receptive to all sorts of theories of racial differences. The application of Mendel's genetic theories about dominant and recessive traits in plants to human beings launched a wrong-headed and dangerous foray into eugenics. From the early 19th century, self-styled scientists had developed all sorts of theories about the inferiority of the Indian race. Samuel George Morton, a Philadelphia patrician who had 2 medical degrees, hypothesized that skull size was correlated with mental capacity. As a result of his phrenological studies, he concluded, quote, "it must be borne in mind that the Indian is incapable of servitude, and that his spirit sunk at once in captivity, and with his physical energy, whereas the more pliant Negro, yielding to his fate and accommodating himself to his condition, bore his heavy burden with comparative ease." Unquote. One of Morton's successors, Josiah Nott, wrote, quote, "it is vain to talk of civilizing Indians. We might as well attempt to change the nature of the buffalo." Unquote. Those who didn't see race as destiny, though, had plenty of theories of their own. Many Christian missionaries saw it as their duty to, quote, civilize, unquote, American Indians, almost as soon as settlers made contact with Indians. In the 18th century, the founder of Dartmouth College told his sponsors he'd, quote, cure the natives of their savage temper, unquote, and, quote, purge all the Indian out, unquote, of his Indian students. As Fergus Bordwick says in his book, Killing the White Man's Indian, quote, education was seen by well-intentioned Americans both as moral imperative and as practical gateway to modern civilization. However, their optimism was often rooted in the naive conviction that Indians were but blank slates waiting to be inscribed with the vigorous script of American civilization, unquote. Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts, who served from 1875 to 1893, wasn't quite so insensitive, though, as Bordwick tells the story. In fact, Dawes considered the history of United States-Indian relations to be one of, quote, of spoliation, of wars, and of humiliation, unquote. More importantly, he believed that Indians had the same capacity for education, independence, and economic success as their white brothers, if only the right policies were put in place. Dawes proposed to take all the reservation land that was held in common, divide it up among Indians individually, and put the rest for sale to white settlers. In October 1886, he told a group assembled at Lake Mohawk in upstate New York, quote, if you will prepare the Indian to take care of himself upon this land that is allotted, you will find the solution to the whole question. He shall have a home and be a citizen of the United States, shall be one of us, contributing his share to all that goes to make up the strength and glory of citizenship in the United States, unquote. After he proposed this allotment, one of his colleagues told the assembly, quote, I have more than once spoken of Senator Dawes' severalty bill as the act of emancipation for the Indian. I believe when it is passed, it will enroll his name with that of Lincoln as an emancipator of those in bonds, unquote. In 1887, Congress passed the General Allotment Act, known as the Dawes Act, which surveyed Indian lands and divided them into parcels, allowing individual Indians to apply for ownership of plots of land. Though many of these parcels weren't actually given over completely. The head of a family could receive 160 acres. People under the age of 18 would receive 40 acres. Indians had 4 years to select the plot they wanted. After that, the Secretary of the Interior would select it for them. The federal government would hold the land, quote, in trust, unquote, for the Indians. But after 25 years had lapsed, the Indians would own the land outright. Well, almost. According to the language of the Dawes Act, quote, at the expiration of said period, the United States will convey the same by patent to said Indian, or his heirs, as aforesaid, in fee discharged of said trust, and free of all charge or encumbrance whatsoever, provided that the President of the United States may in any case in his discretion extend the period, unquote. There are interesting similarities to the, quote, 40 acres and a mule, unquote, policy implemented after the Civil War to give freed slaves rights to abandoned land previously owned by slaveholders. Of course, in that case, the land was rarely allotted, and there was no federal money to purchase it for former slaves either. But the connection between owning land and having full citizenship was a strong one. Dawes and his colleagues in Washington clearly believed that if Indians got the former, they'd be entitled to and embrace the responsibilities of the latter. Their confidence in Indians' ability to take their fate into their own hands was striking, and it's a sentiment rarely heard among politicians today. The wording of the Dawes Act continued. that upon the completion of said allotments and the patenting of the lands to said allottees, each and every number of each of the respective bands or tribes of Indians to whom allotments have been made shall have the benefit of and be subject to the laws, both civil and criminal, of the state or territory in which they may reside. In no territory shall pass or enforce any law denying any such Indian within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. And every Indian born within the territorial limits of the United States, to whom allotments shall have been made under the provisions of this act, or under any law or treaty, and every Indian born within the territorial limits of the United States, who has voluntarily taken up, with said limits, his residence separate and apart from any tribe of Indians therein, and has adopted the habits of civilized life, is hereby declared to be a citizen of the United States, and is entitled to all the rights, privileges, and immunities of such citizens, whether said Indian has been or not, by birth or otherwise, a member of any tribe of Indians within the territorial limits of the United States, without in any manner affecting the right of any such Indian to tribal or other property. The way the Dawes Act was carried out, though, was not as Dawes or his contemporaries had promised, nor were its effects what they had expected. In some cases, Indians who didn't choose a parcel of land were jailed. Whites often got the best land, and sometimes the only land that was adjacent to water sources. Some of the land had been surveyed badly, and so its ownership was unclear. By the time the policy ended in 1934, land under Indian ownership had shrunk by 65%. In 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act placed all the land not held fully by individuals into, quote, a trust, unquote. Sometimes known as the Indian New Deal, the Indian Reorganization Act was intended to stem the flow of land out of Indian hands. Land that hadn't already been transferred into fee simple ownership, that is, land that wasn't owned outright, was put into trust by the federal government. From that point on, the land couldn't be sold to non-Indians, but even land transfers among Indians or between Indians and the tribal government were heavily monitored by the federal government. In fact, as Anderson points out, bureaucratic interests as much as anything have historically driven the United States government's Indian policy. The effects of the trust have been disastrous for economic development on Indian lands. First, because most trust land is held communally, individuals don't want to invest in it, and they can't use it as collateral either. As John Kopish, a writer at Forbes, explains, quote, "This leads to what economists call the tragedy of the commons. If everyone owns the land, no one does. So the result is substandard housing and the barren, run-down look that comes from a lack of investment, overuse, and environmental degradation. It's a look that's common worldwide, wherever secure property rights are lacking. Much of Africa and South America, inner-city housing projects, and rent-controlled apartment buildings in the U.S. Indian reservations," unquote. As one tribal leader describing a similar situation in Canada explained to Kopish, quote, "Markets haven't been allowed to operate in reserve lands. We've been legislated out of the economy. When you don't have individual property rights, you can't build, you can't be bonded, and you can't pass on wealth. A lot of small businesses never get started because people can't leverage property to raise funds," unquote. Even if an individual technically holds the land, the fact that it's trust land means that the federal government has a say in how it's used, which makes it significantly less valuable. A 1992 study by Terry Anderson and Dean Luke found that agricultural productivity on individual trust lands was 30 to 40% less, and on tribal trust lands, 80 to 90% less than on fee simple lands on a reservation, where a given title rests entirely with an individual. Although tribes have been granted somewhat more power over decisions regarding their land in recent years, quote, at least 4 federal agencies are involved in the execution of any energy lease on tribal lands. Not only does the BIA's trust authority raise the cost of energy development on Indian trust lands, it has a long history of not living up to its fiduciary responsibility of managing Indian trust funds, unquote. In 1996, a class action suit against the BIA for this mismanagement resulted in a settlement of $3.4 billion. Underlying federal policy are the assumptions that Indians are simply incapable of managing their own affairs, and that natural resource development somehow runs contrary to their traditions. Researchers have examined this latter assumption in recent years. In his book, 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus, Charles Mann looks at the scholarly consensus and concludes that the land was hardly, quote, pristine, unquote, before Europeans' arrival. For example, Mann says of the Amazon rainforests, quote, the new picture doesn't automatically legitimate burning down the forest. Instead, it suggests that for a long time, clever people who knew tricks that we have yet to learn, used big chunks of Amazonia non-destructively. Faced with an ecological problem, the Indians fixed it. Rather than adapt to nature, they fixed it, unquote. Another common assumption about Indians today is that they're traditionally communists, sharing all property. But the truth is much more complicated, and historians have found significant evidence of individual and family-held property rights among individual Indian tribes. In the 1974 Bolt decision, which granted fishing rights to Indians in the Pacific Northwest, presiding judge George Bolt cited the history of Indian fishing in the area in his decision. Quote, generally, individual Indians had primary use rights in the territory where they resided and permissive use rights in the natal territory, if this was different, or in territories where they had consanguineal kin. Subject to such individual claims, most groups claimed autumn fishing use rights in the waters near to their winter villages. Spring and summer fishing areas were often more distantly located and often were shared with other groups from other villages, unquote. Indians invested significant effort in ensuring an adequate supply of fish each year. The idea that prior to the whites' arrival, Indians were simply roving bands living off whatever wildlife they happened to come upon, and then sharing it equally among themselves, runs contrary to history. Not to mention everything we know about human ingenuity and human nature. But it's an idea that continues to dictate public policy. For today's journalists and historians looking back at the Dawes Act, the problem is clear. As Bordewick wrote, quote, like many of his contemporaries in the golden age of capitalism, Dawes perceived private property as an almost magical force, a severe but benevolent taskmaster with transformative power, unquote. The truth of the matter is that Dawes was right. Private property is an almost magical force. As any survey of world history demonstrates, countries that have adopted private property rights and the rule of law to enforce them are better off by almost every measure. Over the past 200 years, with the spread of capitalism, global per capita income has increased more than tenfold, and average life expectancy has more than doubled. As Leonard Carlson notes in his 1981 book, Indians, Bureaucrats, and Land, quote, No student of property rights, or indeed economic theory, will be surprised that the complicated and heavily supervised property right that emerged from allotment led to inefficiencies, corruption, and losses for both Indians and society." Unquote. In addition to the corruption that dominated the initial process of assigning allotments, there was also the 25-year waiting period before Indians actually owned their plot of land outright. This provision, ostensibly intended to protect Indians from selling their land to rapacious whites before Indians were judged, quote, "competent," unquote, to know their own interests, had the effect of diminishing the land's value. Imagine that you were broke and someone gave you an acre of land, but told you that you had to wait 25 years to sell it. Unless you wanted to start planting vegetables tomorrow, what good would it do you? You couldn't even use it as collateral to get a loan, because technically it wouldn't be yours yet. These kinds of provisions have the effect of sucking the magical powers out of a system of private property. In other words, Indians have long suffered from what Nobel Prize-winning economist Hernando de Soto has called, quote, "dead capital," unquote. They may possess a certain amount of land on paper, but they can't put it to use by selling it, buying more to take advantage of economies of scale, and borrowing against it. Quote, "There are, of course, arguments that the allotment experiment was a failure because it transferred so much land to whites," unquote, notes Anderson. Quote, "but there is no systematic evidence to test this proposition. Certainly, vast amounts of land were transferred to whites, but by itself this is not prima facie evidence that Indians were left off worse. If land was taken without compensation, there is no doubt that Indians were disadvantaged. To determine the impact of voluntary sales, we would have to know the sales price relative to the value of the land to Indians had it been retained by them. In other words, if you had a piece of land and you sold it for a fair market value, no one would look at the situation and suggest that you had suffered some kind of great loss or had been swindled. Excuse me. You might simply have decided that the money you could get was more valuable to you than the land. Particularly when it comes to farmland, this determination is often based on how large a plot of land you own. Agricultural productivity is based on economies of scale. A reasonable person, whether Indian or non-Indian, might decide that 160 acres isn't enough to make farming worth it, or might rather have the money from the sale of the land and do something else with it. Not everyone aspires to be a farmer, but the Dawes Act, as it was written, didn't take sufficient account of these possibilities, and those who assess its success or failure today typically don't either. If the idea behind U.S. policy in the early 20th century was either to help Indians or to help white settlers, the easiest way of accomplishing this would have been to grant a simple title to the land to either group and let each do what they wanted. But, quote, "had the land been given directly to Indians or whites, what role would there have been for the Office of Indian Affairs?" Unquote. Anderson asks pointedly, although the Dawes Act was ostensibly implemented with the idea of making Indians independent and regular citizens of the United States, Washington's oversight of them increased significantly the longer the policy was in place. From 1900 to 1920, the number of employees grew from 101 to 262. Today, there are about 9,000 employees of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Indian Education. This result, says Anderson, quote, "is hardly surprising as bureaucrats are highly unlikely to sit back and watch their mission and jobs wither. The BIA found its raison d'etre with the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934, unquote. Now the goal was no longer to make Indians independent of federal oversight, but to permanently enshrine that federal oversight. In the name of protecting Indians from rapacious white people, the federal government has made itself indispensable to Indians' daily economic lives. Meanwhile, Indian land has become all but useless to Indians themselves. The patchwork left by Dawes and the Indian Reorganization Act has meant that reservations include land owned by individual Indians, land owned by individual non-Indians, land owned in trust by individual Indians, and land owned in trust by the tribe. Any major development, whether real estate or natural resources, involves such complex negotiations that it's rarely worth the cost. Moreover, the federal government determined that land owned by individuals would be inherited equally by their children. It's possible for an individual to stipulate otherwise in a will, but as Small and plenty of other individuals have confirmed to me, wills weren't part of traditional Indian culture, and few people ever wrote one. The result is that, quote, throughout Indian country, most allotments have been subdivided and redivided so many times that they are worthless to the nominal owners, unquote. Borwick asserts, he notes that in the early 90s, the chairman of the Omaha tribe was receiving, quote, a total of $2.40 annually for his share of family allotment, whose ownership is splintered among more than 200 heirs. Much land that is Indian owned on paper has in fact become so fragmented that to be made economically viable at all, it has had to be leased out by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to white farmers and ranchers. Unquote. In summary, the Dawes Act wasn't a good test of property rights because Indians never had them. In the past few decades, tribes in both the United States and Canada, which adopted a, quote, reserve system, unquote, similar to our reservations, have attempted end runs around this policy. Some tribes will back mortgages for individuals, essentially putting up tribal coffers as collateral on the loan. The effects are as predictable as they are disastrous, with bands like the Kamloops in British Columbia paying millions of dollars a year to Canadian banks on behalf of their delinquent members. Some tribes have made informal arrangements with banks, promising that if the banks are forced to foreclose, the tribe will help them find another buyer within the tribe so that they can recoup their losses. When I asked Suzanne Woodrow, the Assistant Vice President and Helena, Montana branch executive of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank, whether any of these strategies has been successful at improving rates of homeownership or credit on the reservations, she tells me, quote, the short answer is no, unquote. Woodrow has spent much of the last 15 years helping tribes develop commercial law codes to encourage investment in private enterprise on the reservations. She describes some of the complex financial arrangements that tribe members have used to make mortgages possible, and they're nothing less than dizzying. As an example, Conrad Stewart tells me, quote, I had my dad give me a home site lease on his property. That way the mortgage is not attached to the land. It's attached to the lease interest and based on the mortgage, unquote. Home site leases are typically entered into a period of 25 years and then renewable for another 25. They're common on Indian land because of the difficulties of getting a regular mortgage, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs monitors them heavily. A group called PLACE Advocacy, based in Bozeman, Montana, tries to help Indians navigate these obstacles. Its website features a flowchart of 10 steps, not including any steps taken by the lender, that must be completed for such a lease to be approved. Perhaps the most noteworthy part of this document, though, is the helpful cartoon on the side explaining that leases can be agreed upon only for, quote, fair market value, unquote. Fair market value, quote, is the dollar value of a property based on a formal appraisal by the Office of Special Trustee in Billings, unquote. A bureaucratic appraisal would obviously not be the definition of, quote, fair market value, unquote, offered in most introductory economics textbooks. But on reservations, there can't be anything called, quote, fair market value, unquote, when it comes to land, because none of the land is privately owned. Quote, the American dream is home ownership, unquote, laments Stewart. Quote, but that's not really possible here, unquote. But there's more than home ownership at stake. Americans' homes are one of the primary repositories of American wealth. And for those who want to start a business, they're one of the primary sources of startup capital. But because Indians don't own their land, or in most cases their homes, they can't get credit, making it extraordinarily difficult for them to set up a small business. Stewart sums up the situation, quote, "We are the highest regulated race in the world," unquote. Not only have individual American Indians been regulated into a kind of paralysis, larger economic projects on the reservation have all but stopped as a result of federal oversight. If property rights on reservations were well defined, it would not only improve the housing stock and the general appearance of these communities, but also significantly boost economic development. As Terry Anderson and Sean Regan of the Property and Environmental Research Center wrote in 2013, quote, "Crossing into reservations, especially into the West, reveals islands of poverty in a sea of wealth," unquote. Crows and Northern Cheyennes sit on some of the largest oil, gas, and coal reserves in the country. Indian reservations, Anderson and Reagan note, quote, "contain almost 30% of the nation's coal reserves west of the Mississippi, 50% of the potential uranium reserves, and 20% of known oil and gas reserves," unquote. Resources worth nearly 1.5 trillion, or 290,000 per tribal member. Tragically, quote, 86% of Indian lands with energy or mineral potential remain undeveloped because of federal control of reservations that keeps Indians from fully capitalizing on their natural resources if they desire, unquote. In order to tap into these reserves, Indians, whether the land is tribally held or individually held, must follow a 49-step process. These steps involve the Bureau of Land Management, the Department of the Interior, the Department of Justice, the Commerce Department, explains an exasperated Stewart. And it could take months, if not years, for each step to be approved. Just to dig a hole, he says, requires a $6,500 upfront payment for an application for a permit to drill, APD. Compare that, Stewart says, to the process just off the reservation, which requires about $125 and 15 minutes for the APD, and then a mere 5-step process for the permit to be approved. Stewart explains that although the tribe has had a coal mine since 1973, little progress has been made in getting resources out of the ground. The mine is the second largest in the nation, with 3% of the world's coal reserves, but it extracts only 5 million tons a year. A few miles off the reservation at Powder River, the yearly extraction is close to 120 million tons a year. It's true that not every reservation is enthusiastic about the idea of natural resource development. The Northern Cheyennes are conducting a referendum on the issue. And though Ivan Small believes most tribe members would be in favor of it, he suggests that the tribal government is overly influenced by people concerned about the environmental impact. Winfield Russell of the Northern Cheyenne Tribal Council says he worries that development of the land, quote, will undermine or destroy native culture, unquote. Russell says he's not taking a position on the issue, but he sees a strong connection between the untouched land and the tribe's spiritual values. Unlike many other tribes, he says, quote, we're still strong here as far as our ceremonial culture and spirit on the reservation. We still have our covenant here, unquote. Northern Cheyenne lands are almost entirely held in tribal trust, which means that no economic development on the reservation can happen without a vote of tribe members. In addition to all those bureaucratic steps at the federal level, this is why, for instance, the tribal 2-year school, Chief Dull Knife College, can't expand its facility even though enrollment has skyrocketed. Quote, they will have to build up, not out, unquote, says Russell. Quote, the college borders on a cemetery, and there is other land we can't go onto, unquote. The absurdity of adding additional stories to a building, this isn't New York City, on a reservation with hundreds of thousands of empty acres doesn't seem to strike anyone. The Northern Cheyennes would sure use the money and jobs a coal mine like the Crows would bring. The unemployment rate among the 8,000 tribe members who live on the reservation is more than 80%. And when I ask Russell how those members are employed, he offers the following list: Tribal Health Services, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, reservation schools, the Roads Department, the Tribal Court, Tribal Prosecution, our Recovery Center, and our Tribal College. That's it. He mentions not a single private enterprise. Russell laments that the most talented people on the reservation tend to leave. Quote, on the outside, they have more pay, better benefits. That is where a person will go. That's what usually happens, unquote. When I ask him what could be done to improve economic opportunity on the reservation, he tells me, quote, more assistance from the federal government, helping the tribal government and financially assisting them in getting grants to the tribes, unquote. He also suggests the need for reforms at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but nothing Russell suggests would do anything to encourage private enterprise. It would merely continue the same kind of dependent relationship the tribe has with the federal government right now. To make matters worse, the federal government isn't even legally bound to deliver subsidies to Indians. In Cherokee Nation versus Hitchcock, 1902, and Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock, 1903, the Supreme Court ruled that treaties signed with Indians could be modified or terminated without Indians' consent. Indian leaders continued to cite the U.S. government's treaty obligations when explaining the need for government to provide funding for education or health care. But the Snyder Act of 1921 allows the federal government to treat all tribes the same, regardless of the treaties those tribes signed. And as the Cater Report notes, the Snyder Act, quote, made Indian social programs subject to the same congressional spending adjustments as other programs, unquote. Sadly, it seems that these spending adjustments are always going in one direction, up, and there's a general assumption that these programs will simply be permanent, but there's no guarantee. To know just how much the economy on the reservation depends on public funds, one need only learn the effects that the federal government shutdown in the fall of 2013 had on Indian reservations. Take the Crow tribe. Some 364 Crow members, more than a third of the tribe's workforce, were furloughed. A bus service, the only way some Crows are able to travel across the 2.3 million acre reservation, was shuttered. A home health care program for sick tribal members was suspended. The Yurok tribe in Northern California relies almost solely on federal financing to operate. Its reservation has 80% unemployment rate. As a result of the shutdown, the tribe furloughed 60 to its 310 employees, closed its child care center, and halted emergency financial assistance to low-income and older members. Financing for a program that ensures clean drinking water on the reservation ran low. These tribes are so dependent on the federal government that without money from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, their economic activity comes to a complete halt, and their members may not have access to clean drinking water. Despite the vast amount of federal money that does usually flow to these communities, there's little accountability. Though there were some reforms in the 1970s, many tribal governments are rife with corruption, and the lack of private economy makes things worse. If all jobs are government jobs, then they become all the more important as prizes to be given to supporters or simply to extended family. Still, in every community I visited, a few people like Ivan Small understood that no amount of federal funds was going to stop the poverty and dysfunction. What they longed for wasn't more money. They didn't care for more apologies or hand-wringing from white folks in Washington. What they wanted was a Senior Dawes once promised their people: emancipation. The problem is the same in Canada, says Manny Jules, one of the leaders of the Kamloops band in the province of British Columbia. First Nations, as some Canadian Aboriginals are called, don't have real property rights. And property rights, Jules said, quote, are human rights, unquote. Of course, the notion that Indians believe in property rights is contrary to everything that you hear about Aboriginal peoples, he notes. A small, gray-haired man with a warm smile, Jules went to art school when he was younger, hoping to become a sculptor. But he put that pursuit aside to assume a leadership role. First as a counselor of the Kamloops band, then as its chief and one of the co-founders of the Shuswap Tribal Council, of which the Kamloops band is a part. The city of Kamloops, 2011 population, 85,678, enjoys a gorgeous setting. In the same hotel I stay at are hikers, mountain bikers, and nature lovers. In the heart of the Kamloops is the confluence of the North and South Thompson Rivers, the former flowing from the Thompson Glacier at the foot of the Caribou Mountains, the latter coming from the little Shuswap Lake, which, at 7 miles long and 5 miles wide, is not so little. In the summer, Canadian and international travelers eager to experience the region's natural beauty come in busloads. The days are hot and dry, but in the evenings when the temperature cools down, families gather at the well-kept public beaches and parks along the rivers. There are a few expensive restaurants in Kamloops whose menu empathize, quote, local ingredients, unquote. But mostly the city has a feel of middle-class oasis, where people have found the right balance of work and play. Railway lines meet here, so the region is a hub of economic activity. There are coal mines and copper mines. Natural resources are plentiful. But if you want to see how the land question affects members of First Nations, drive at night to the top of one of the peaks overlooking the city. On one side of the river, there are lights everywhere, apartment buildings, homes, businesses, and hotels. On the other side, the land held by Jules' band, there's mostly darkness. It's not quite as stark as the difference between North and South Korea in satellite images, but it comes remarkably close. The first thing you notice when you drive to the other side of the river is the waterfront. Right on the edge of the rivers is a trailer park with hundreds of homes so close together, you might as well be on top of one another. A little ways back from that are some lumber yards and car dealerships, interspersed with small homes, many of which are badly in need of repair. Much of this part of town has a feel of impermanence to it, and that's no accident, explains Andre Le Dresse of Fiscal Realities Economists, a group that conducts economic research and analysis, develops innovative solutions, and advises and advocates for public, First Nation, and private sector clients. In the Kamloops area, Le Dresse estimates that a First Nation member owned home is worth about 1/20th what it's worth off reserve. Quote, these are classic economic results, unquote. Quote, you don't see big permanent structure leases for less than 15 years, unquote. Le Dresse tells me as we drive around the Indian side of the water. On the side that's not a reserve, homes sell for more than $500,000. But here, the most profit to be made off the land is from a trailer park. Since the band has no money, they're unable to create the public parks and other facilities you see on the other side of Kamloops. They're barely able to keep up with the projects they do oversee. The cemetery holds victims of the 1860 smallpox epidemic, as well as veterans of the World Wars, Korea, and Vietnam, but it looks overgrown. The local Catholic Church is undergoing a much-needed renovation, but the houses around it are falling apart. In another attempt to work around the land problem, some First Nations have arrangements whereby a bank will give band members a mortgage. But if the members default, the band itself is on the hook for the money. The results are predictable. The Kamloops band is paying more than $2 million a year in arrears. And it's not only the mortgage payments that are the problem, it's the upkeep. Le Dresse tells me that, quote, average lifespan of a tribal home is 15 years, unquote. That is, homes are so poorly cared for that they need to be completely demolished and rebuilt after only 15 years. There's one large gated community on the Indian side of the river. The tribe came to a complex agreement with the developer for a 99-year lease on the land. The community has its own restaurant, golf course, and plenty of non-Indians have purchased homes here. But for every development project that has succeeded, several others have fallen through. 20 years ago, a plan for a big hotel and residential development brought together 7 or 8 landowners, Le Dresse recalls. Quote, but it took so long to get the regulatory approvals and the environmental approvals that the lenders got nervous. One of the front men eventually committed suicide because of all the pressure. It never took off, unquote. Studies by Fiscal Realities have found that development on the Indian side of the river takes, on average, 4 to 6 times longer than development on land off the reserve. Jules supports a parliamentary proposal, the First Nations Property Ownership Act, which would address this problem by allowing First Nations to have title to their own lands instead of having the Canadian and federal government hold those lands in trust. But, quote, one of the biggest challenges we face in convincing people about, quote, the Nation's Property Ownership Act is mythology, unquote, says Le Dresse. Quote, the popular understanding of Indigenous culture is that it's almost like there was a socialist utopia for millennia, unquote. But such a utopia never existed. As Le Dresse notes, quote, in any other circumstances, such society would have been impossible, unless you consider North Korea a success story, unquote. But people continue to impose this history on First Nations as if they're exceptions to human nature. A lot of the literature on First Nations history and traditions was written in the 1960s and 1970s, a time when environmentalism and socialism were surging in the West. More was contributed in the 1980s, a time of political correctness, when scholars pushed the notion that traditional cultures were far ahead of the dominant Western one because of the communalist impulses. After engaging in extensive research on his own communities and others in Canada, the United States, and Mexico, Jules has come to the conclusion that it is all bunk. Quote, property rights are part of Indigenous culture, unquote. He tells me in no uncertain terms, as he explains, quote, in my community, we have some of the oldest pit house sites, unquote. Pit houses were permanent structures requiring considerable time and resources to build. Quote, they were nice and toasty, warm in the winter. In the summer, we went out and gathered salmon, berries, wild vegetables, and hunted game. In the winter, we came back to settled villages. There is no way we would have left and come back to allow some other family to live in our pit house, unquote. And yet, political leaders and educators continue to offer sentimental myths in place of this history. Michelle Obama recently told a gathering of Native American youth, quote, long before the United States was even an idea, your ancestors were harvesting the crops that would feed the world for centuries to come, unquote. And, quote, today on issues like conservation and climate change, we are finally beginning to embrace the wisdom of your ancestors, unquote. Miss Obama hasn't discovered some ancient Indian texts that predicted the melting of the glaciers. There's little evidence that Indians had fundamentally different understanding of the environment than any other people on Earth, which is to say, when resources were scarce, natives worked to conserve them. When resources weren't scarce, they didn't. Take, for instance, the oft-repeated notion that Indians would, quote, use every part of the animal, unquote, because of their concern for nature and their desire not to waste its treasures. History doesn't back that up. In a 2002 article called Buffaloed, The Myth and Reality of Bison in America, historian Larry Schweikart notes that some Indian tribes cleared large amounts of forest with, quote, controlled burns, unquote, for hunting purposes. They would divert game into small, unburned areas to make it easier to hunt the animals. As if that weren't bad enough from an environmental perspective, Schweikart says, the intentional fires often got out of control without modern firefighting equipment, flashed through forests, destroying everything in their path. Deer, beaver, and birds of all sorts were already on a trajectory to extinction in some areas. Because over and above the hunting done by Indians, natural predators and disasters thinned herds, unquote. Other hunting methods included the buffalo jump, in which a man would lure an entire herd over a cliff. As Schweikart notes, quote, led to horrible waste and inefficient use of resources, unquote. When buffalo were plentiful, they were hunted without regard to waste. When their numbers dwindled, things changed. To the extent that Native Americans of old cared about conservation, it was when they owned things. Jules notes that the same is true of the natives who lived in Canada, saying, quote, the teepees were owned by individual women, unquote. He leans in to emphasize the point, quote, the concept that we never had private property has been foisted upon us, unquote. It's interesting that in revisionist academics' attempts to suggest that the First Nations are more advanced due to their communal attitudes, they've actually, quote, reinforced the notion that we are not as advanced as somebody else, as Western culture, unquote. Jules believes that time for passively accepting that status quo is over. During 3 decades of involvement in tribal leadership, he has tried to significantly alter federal policy toward Indians, creating greater political and economic autonomy for First Nations. He has worked with other leaders to develop political clout so that Canadian government can't ignore them. Self-sufficiency has become Jules' mantra for the Kamloops Band and for the First Nations of Canada. He seems to have the right combination of experience and optimism to make changes happen in his community. Jules' father, a logger and a cowboy who could, according to Jules, quote, ride from time he could walk, unquote, set up the first industrial park on a Canadian reserve. In 1963, 14 businesses opened there, but the logistical problems of doing business on the reserve immediately became obvious. Jules' father had a tough time getting anyone to plow the roads in winter. The province claimed that snow removal was the federal government's responsibility because the reserve was federal land. But the federal government said it was the province's responsibility because the province collected taxes on the land. This controversy led to a decades-long fight with the Canadian government, specifically over issues of taxation, but more broadly about political and economic autonomy for First Nations. In 1988, thanks to Jules's leadership in calling for reform, Parliament passed, quote, the Kamloops Amendment, unquote, the first ever nation-led change to the Indian Act. The Indian Act has regulated the 614 First Nation bands in Canada ever since it was passed in 1876. The Kamloops Amendment established the empowerment of government of First Nations to levy property taxes on reserves, including taxes on leasehold developments like the industrial park Jules' father helped launch. It also allowed governments of First Nations to set land aside for leasing and economic development without the land losing its reserve status. This was the first step in gaining more fiscal and political autonomy for First Nations. The First Nations Property Ownership Act would create the legal framework for individual members of First Nations to access capital through secure property rights. This legislation would make First Nations like small provinces or cities. Just as land belongs to the City of Quebec, even though residents of the city can buy and sell it among themselves. So people in the Kamloops band would be able to have individual title to their land, to do with as they wish. At the same time, the land would be taxed and its public facilities would be maintained by the band. The First Nations Property Ownership Act could be a political and economic game changer for Aboriginal peoples. But to understand why, it's necessary to know more about the history of First Nations in Canada, as well as the ways in which Canadian reserve system is different from the U.S. reservation system. The Canadian and American systems have common origins in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. As Kathy Brock wrote in her contribution to Canada and the United States, Differences That Count, quote, embedded in the British Proclamation is an ambivalence that gave rise to two very different histories of Aboriginal governance in Canada and the United States. On the one hand, the proclamation recognized that Indian nations were independent and should be dealt with through treaties by central authorities. The document established the basis of treaty and reservation land systems and provided a basis for current land claims. On the other hand, the proclamation confirmed that Indian tribes possessed a limited sovereignty and were subject to British rule. Thus, they were not seen as equal to European nations, and limits were imposed on their actions when practically possible. Unquote. Although Brock, a professor in the School of Policy Studies and Department of Political Studies at Queen's University, argues that the U.S. government has largely allowed tribes to govern themselves, for better or for worse, as long as they stay within their reservation borders and live without any property rights, the Canadian policy has been characterized by micromanagement of tribal affairs. In addition to the forced assimilation carried out by the residential schooling programs, to be covered in Chapter 4, which also exists in the United States, but to a much smaller extent, Brock says, quote, almost every conceivable facet of First Nation life and culture was subject to scrutiny and regulation by Indian Affairs officials, unquote. Although Indian agents were largely absent from American reservations after the first decade of the 20th century, Indian agents, also known as superintendents, weren't removed from Canadian reserves until 1975, and then it was because of members of First Nations, quote, occupied, unquote, these offices and kicked them out. Remarkably, the Canadian government even determines who is and who isn't a member of a First Nation. If your bloodline is too diluted due to intermarriage, Ottawa will not regard you as Indian. In America, as long as a person is claimed by an officially recognized tribe, he or she is treated as American Indian. Ironically, the fact that so much power rests with the federal government means that significant policy changes have been much more forthcoming in Canada than in the United States. These shifts began in the 1960s, Brock explains to me. Quote, as part of dialogue around the world about the importance of self-government, unquote. In 1973, the Canadian Supreme Court recognized Aboriginal title to the land in Calder v. British Columbia. The landmark Calder case clarified matters only so much, though. 3 of the justices claimed that Indian title to the land existed at one point, but had been extinguished by virtue of the government's exercise of control over the lands. Which is to say that since the Canadian government had been in charge of their lands for so long, Indians could no longer claim title. The other 3 justices said more evidence had to be presented to show that the title was extinguished. Even though the practical results of Calder was unclear, says Brock, quote, it proved to be a catalyst, unquote. A lot of administrative arrangements were transferred to Indian bands. The opening up of oil and gas resources in Western Canada brought many of these issues on economic independence to a head. In 1982, the Canadian government, quote, patriated, unquote, the Constitution from Britain. It also adopted a Charter of Rights, which included a section of Aboriginal land and titles. Prior to this, the Canadian Constitution was technically part of British law. This new stage of Canadian law provided an opportunity to alter and clarify the Canadian federal government's relationship with First Nations. Starting in 1984, a series of court decisions advanced the claims and rights of First Nations. There were a number of talks between the Prime Minister, leaders of First Nations, and provincial leaders to try to define Aboriginal rights. Talks broke down in 1987, with no clear definition emerging. But, as Brock tells me, quote, Aboriginals were established as the rightful leaders for their community, unquote. Much of the impetus for these court decisions and political negotiations came from the province of British Columbia. In part, this was because so many British Columbian tribes never signed off official treaties with the colonial British or French government, unlike tribes in the eastern parts of Canada. And so their relationship with the Canadian government was even more ambiguous than that of their peers to the east. With the wealth of natural resources up for grabs in British Columbia, the area was ripe for litigation. The only bands in British Columbia that did have agreements with the former British government were the groups of the southern part of Vancouver Island that had signed the Douglas Treaties. Between 1850 and 1864, Sir James Douglas served as a representative of Hudson's Bay Company, and then as governor of Vancouver Island in British Columbia. He was primarily interested in maintaining a peaceable environment for trading, and, as such, sought to purchase land from the nations in the area. Douglas seemed to recognize that Indians thought of the land as their own, not as belonging to everyone or the gods or nature, broadly speaking, as is often assumed. On March 25, 1861, Douglas wrote to the Duke of Newcastle, who was then Secretary of State for the Canadian colonies, quote, praying for the aid of Her Majesty's government in extinguishing the Indian title to the public lands in this colony, unquote. He wanted money to pay the Indians for the land, arguing that the natives had, quote, distinct ideas of property and land, and mutually recognized their several exclusive rights in certain districts, unquote. The First Nations varied in size, and some of them were effectively extended families, whereas others divided up their land among different families within the band. The point is this: even before Europeans arrived, the First Nations in the area had divided the land among themselves and didn't think of it as collectively held or alternately unowned. Douglas warned that failure to extinguish title and, quote, the occupation of such portions of the colony by white settlers, unless the full consent of their propriety tribes, quote, would be perceived, quote, as national wrongs, engender feelings of irritation against the settlers, and endanger the peace of the country, unquote. As the authors of a recent paper prepared for the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs explain, quote, Douglas estimated that it would cost £3,000 sterling to extinguish title to the remaining settled districts of the colony. He asked that British government extend a loan in the form of grant to be repaid from the proceeds of consequent sale of public lands in the colony, unquote. The British government turned him down, and as a result, most of the First Nations in British Columbia remained without treaties right up until recent times. A new treaty process was begun in 1993, under which tribes were supposed to give up their claims to certain land and occupy others in return for compensation. About a third of the tribes in British Columbia have begun the process, but not much progress has been made. And the future of such negotiations doesn't look promising. According to Mark Milk, the author of the report for the Fraser Institute, a Canadian think tank, quote, after 15 years of negotiation with BC Indian bands at a cost of more than $1.1 billion, the province has only 8 treaties that have either been passed, initialed, or are in the financial negotiation stage, unquote. The report is titled Incomplete, Illiberal, and Expensive, a review of 15 years of treaty negotiations in British Columbia and proposals for reform. And Milk notes that, quote, government representatives have taken negotiating positions that will lead to never-ending discussions and the creation of massive legal and regulatory bodies to support ongoing consultation. Effectively, this means the treaty process never ends, unquote. Meanwhile, the legal question of Aboriginal title is working its way through the courts as well. Do First Nations have any claim to land that is not part of their reserves? After Calder, cases in 1984 and 1997, and most recently in 2014, expanded and solidified Aboriginal title as a concept in Canadian law. Indeed, in 2014, in Tsilhqot'in Nation versus British Columbia, the Supreme Court granted title to First Nations on land that was off of their reserves. The Schaefer claimed that the government of British Columbia didn't have the right to grant a commercial logging license on land that First Nations had occupied continuously for hundreds of years, and the court agreed. Written by Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin, the unanimous ruling says the Aboriginal title, quote, flows from occupation in the sense of regular and exclusive use of land. Occupation sufficient to ground Aboriginal title is not confined to specific sites of settlement, but extends to tracts of land that were regularly used for hunting, fishing, or otherwise exploiting resources, and over which the group exercised effective control at the time of assertion of European sovereignty. Unquote. I think it's a good place to stop it there. I mean, we're 2 hours in, we're only on page 32, but that prologue, or the preface, was pretty big. The preface and the introduction were lengthy. About 15 pages until we get to chapter 2. That's going to be a good one. Thank you so much for being here. Appreciate you.